Given that many of the most successful programs and strategies for ending homelessness involve government funding, does that government funding exclude undocumented immigrants? And if so, how can we best serve undocumented families?
So I would say we have found some of the subsidies don't serve undocumented families if everyone in the household is undocumented. Sometimes we're able to advocate to get Section 8 vouchers if there's one person in the household that is documented. But we have used, particularly we did a program around rapid rehousing here in Oakland that was for victims of domestic violence, and we served many families that were undocumented. So it probably depends on the funding source.
Bravo. Many federal agencies, or was there more? Did anyone else want to respond? Many federal agencies, including the Department of Education, have a very different definition of homelessness from HUD. The Homeless Children and Youth Act has stalled time and again in Congress. How do we as a community work to support HUD aligning their definition, and that would allow more federal dollars to assist vulnerable families who are currently ineligible under HUD's funding?
I'm glad that was brought up.
I don't know if you want to come up, Dan, because some of the questions are also for you.
One of the things I'm glad that was brought up is because right now for our funding, a family has to be literally homeless. That means be on the street or in the shelter. But if shelters are impacted in full, then those families might not be able to get some of the assistance because they aren't literally homeless. So there's a little bit of a rub there.
Nan, you want to? I know you have something to say there.
I mean, we don't support the Homeless Families and Youth Act because it's just too broad. It covers, there are many, many families who are doubled up for economic reasons. That's the standard that it sets, millions. So, and it does not provide any additional resources. So it just makes the pool, it vastly expands the pool of people who are eligible, but does not provide any additional resources. And this is when we have so many families that are literally on the street. So I think there are some common sense approaches to this, and the Senate has taken those common sense approaches in the bills to address people who, are doubled up but have to move imminently. It's 14 days now. I mean, I don't know, 14 days is a randomly picked, number. That is, they have to leave within 14 days. Whatever line you draw, there's going to be someone just over it who looks pretty much like the same family just under it who's not eligible, and it's going to be difficult. But I think for us, it just expands the definition way, way, way too much to a lot of people who really are not homeless. So we're not supportive of it.
I think we need to do work in communicating what our definition of homelessness is, because what I find is when we work with mainstream services or school districts or Children's Hospital, if they're saying this family's homeless and we're saying, well, it's not under the definition, there's a disconnect, and all of a sudden we're not working together and you're not helping. And I think there's some education around what kind of family can get what kind of services and where.
What the Europeans have done there, because you might imagine with all the European countries, and you have national contests as well as within-country contests, is to develop this 16-category typology of homelessness. And, that may sound fairly silly, but what it allows you to do is to say, people who fit in these categories are eligible here, and people who fit in those categories are eligible here, and when I'm talking about homelessness, I just mean this. And so it has helped with the precision of what people are talking about, as opposed to saying there's only one word and we're going to fight about who gets to qualify for that one word.
Yeah, I like that alternative also, actually. I think it'd be really difficult to, it just is such a fraught discussion, and it's so unproductive now, to be honest. It's just my personal feeling, this definition issue, because But I do think that if we, that basically their typology and the Australian typology or definition all are, there are people who are literally homeless, and there are people that are unstably housed, and there are people at risk, and different those different groups need different things, and they can be eligible for different things, and then we wouldn't have to fight about this all the time. We all want to help the families, but, policy is about lines and who pays for what. And so that's what the discussion is about.
I'd just like to add one small comment. As we work with each other in helping people get out of homelessness, we have to be honest with each other and work it. Does that communicate? Yeah.
Regarding transitional housing, why would a longer stay, if multiple services are offered on site, not be a better solution in that it would give more time for parents to work through the issues that may have contributed to their homelessness? Wouldn't housing vouchers further lead to displacement in high rent areas? Those are two separate
Well, I can speak a little bit to the
questions.
transitional. I mean, people are homeless when they're in transitional housing, and they're. I mean, it's not a simple issue about transitional housing. I understand that, and people do need stability, and they do need services. And there are some people who need transitional housing. But I think overall. It's good for people not to be homeless anymore. So people are in a facility and it has a lot of rules, and they're not where they're going to be living, so they can't get their kids in the school necessarily they're going to be in. They can't get a job knowing they're going to be able to get to the job. It's not where they're going to necessarily be, and they're often not living in a very natural environment that's stabilizing for them. So.
I think the other part of that is that the housing interventions are not then divorced from other follow-up services. So the services can be provided, continue to be provided.
Another difficulty with facilities, in addition to the fact that they're located somewhere and wherever they're located might not fit what you want, is that they bring together lots of people that have different sorts of family configurations and different interests. So, this family's husband and father or teenage son is that family's strange male. And this family's young child that needs to run around and be exuberant is stopping that family's adolescent from doing her homework. And so when you bring lots of people who are different into close proximity, not of their choosing, it creates the need for rules and structure that are sort of hard to manage. But the other part of that question was, would vouchers displace? That's certainly the argument the Europeans make. They say, in the limit, if you had vouchers for everybody that needed them, fat chance, then why would a landlord ever accept less than the fair market rent? I mean, aren't you just going to jack up the rents for everybody? And in the limits, that's true, and to what extent we're, the sort of feeble efforts we have at housing subsidies get us there, I don't know. But I appreciated the group that said, we need more affordable housing. It's not that we want more subsidies, it's we want more housing. And we need that too.
Although I will say there are economists that feel that if you subsidize the demand side, that the market would create the units. That the problem is now we don't have, there's low-income tenants can't pay enough to generate creation of units, and that. Mm-hmm. So I mean, there's probably it's a balance between subsidy, I think, probably production.
I'd like to go back to the whole issue of transitional housing and people with greater needs. I am a huge fan of limiting the stay in transitional housing because it brings to the family and to the provider the need to help families as quickly as possible, but also to address their needs in a way that builds the community, resources for them. And so as we in our community are about to launch a coordinated access to housing for homeless families, we need those units. And I'll tell you why we need them. We need them because many of our families who have high needs, you need that time to work with them. So I'm not saying 2 years, I'm saying that we need more time. And so as we transition to coordinated access, we need to have different types of units in the system that can help, and that not to, exclude people, but to invite them in, focus on the needs, and get them out as soon as possible. But you need a variety of resources to do that.
I think that's what Building Futures is facing too. We have 22 units of transitional housing that, because of the way the continuum of care process has gone, we're going to have to convert them to permanent. And it makes me a little nervous because those 22 units will become permanent. We won't have 22 units for flow. Yeah, because, and I can see what we're saying about transitional housing, except in our housing market, where are we going to find 22 units? And so that makes me nervous. So I have to move all 22 families out and bring in permanent housing. And we always need permanent housing, and some of them are family units, so that's great. Now we get permanent supportive housing for families, so that's for the really super, super high need folks. But it makes me nervous because now they're just going to be there, and now I'm not going to have that, that constant flow.
So this is a confusing situation because a lot of transitional housing really has functioned more like shelter, and it's a way station, and we do need that. And I think that it is not good that we're dismantling the crisis system. This is my view. We actually need to be beefing up the crisis system because people need a place to be while we're getting them rehoused, and not a place to. They just need a place to be. It's not to stay. And I'm not really big on, just for the reasons you articulated, on converting transitional housing to permanent supportive housing. Number one,
I just turned in my application.
well, except for you. Okay. But fortunately, I have nothing to do. I'm not involved in that decision making at all, so don't worry about it. But because of the reason you said, it's basically units that people flowed through, and now it's fixed. As those, you're going to have 22 people, and that's great for them. But that's the end of the story. And generally speaking, I think statistically anyway, from the data, we're putting way too many families into permanent supportive housing that need to be supported more in regular rental housing. So we have 300,000 units of permanent supportive housing, and I think 200,000 or so of them are going to families, and there's just no indication that many families who are homeless need permanent supportive housing. And that's a very expensive intervention that I don't think we're using very strategically. So, the continuum of care is a blunt instrument, and I think we're seeing that play out right now. And we would be probably better moving a lot of this transitional housing to crisis, whatever you want to call it, bridge housing, shelter, crisis housing, and not into interim housing, but not into the long term. And I also would say the other model that I am fond of in transitional housing is the transition in place, which is pretty much the same as rapid rehousing, but often with a little bit longer subsidy. So that's basically putting families in an apartment somewhere and delivering the services there, which I think is much more effective than doing that in facilities for some of the reasons Mary Beth articulated.
The other thing, for people that aren't in the housing world, permanent housing just means there's no artificial time limit on it. You can stay there until you want to move or need to move for some other reason. And one of the things we are working on locally, and again, Oakland Housing Authorities and the Alameda County Housing Authority have been really key players in this, is for some people, they're in permanent supportive housing, and their needs for services, they become so stable and their issues are dealt with. They still have issues, they still need some support, but the level of support they need has been a lot lower than when they first entered. And so we're working also on doors out of permanent supportive housing into other forms of ongoing rental assistance, because they still are poor and they still need rental assistance. And they stay in the heavily permanent supportive housing because they can't afford to go elsewhere. But if we can move them into housing and they can still access the lower level services, we can target that permanent supportive housing to the next person with high level needs. So we are working on that also.
And if you have a scatter site model, then you don't need to force them to move.
And it is, and those are
That is,
scattered sites.
you can pull back on the services rather than requiring the family to move.
So there are 3 more questions, so I think we'll just whip through them, and then let's thank everyone. So if to the degree that interventions are not ending poverty and instability for the families, how can we sustain the end of homelessness? Or in other words, what interventions or steps can we take on to end the cycle of homelessness for families?
Well, the questioner may not have meant 2 things, but I hear 2 things there. One is, how do we stop generating homelessness? As long as we have poverty and inequality and high housing costs, we're going to keep generating homelessness. And despite the heroic efforts of all the folks in this room, we're going to keep having people come into homelessness. And that's an advocacy task. It's not a task that the service system can kind of take on. The second issue is for a particular family who's now fallen into homelessness. Well, most people do get out, right? Most people have short-term episodes and manage to get out, and that's partly because of the help that you give them, and it's partly because they go back to that group of people that are hanging on by their fingernails and spending way too much for housing. And so forth, but most people do in fact manage, and maybe that's the service system's goal at the same time that the advocacy goal is to try to reduce the circumstances that generate homelessness.
Wendy?
I also feel that we have to use whatever means possible to change the national focus, the national attention on this issue. That if we can do it for veterans, we can do it for everyone, and building affordable housing for everyone at every income level needs to be recast as a very high priority. And while that will take time, it's what we have to do because this problem is bigger than we are, so that families that are poor can focus on education and better jobs and all of those things. But it's the initial stability of young families that give us hope for the future.
Absolutely.
And this will be the last of, and I didn't actually ask every single question, but some of the panelists are not here anymore, and so I tried to pick ones that had more than one question associated with them. So regarding the finding in Alameda County that return to shelter is associated with low psychosocial challenges, could this be because parents with high challenges fear that their children would be removed if they enter the system, leaving those most in need the most vulnerable?
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine on that. You probably know the system better than I do. It's possible, to the extent that permanent supported housing is out there and available, that people are getting alternative kinds of services and hence not coming back to the system. We found something similar for folks with mental illnesses in New York applying for prevention services, and folks with serious mental illnesses have access to a funding stream that other people don't have access to. So that's the hopeful answer. I don't know about the other one. If you think it's an issue, then it's an issue.
I like ending on a hopeful answer, not a hopeless answer. No, I like ending on a hopeful note. So again, please come to the Everyone Home membership meeting, or if you can't come, sign up to become a member so that you can continue to be involved in solving homelessness in our county. I want to thank the panel and Elaine, who's a panel but standing over there. And I want to thank all of you for the work you do every day and for spending the day with us here today. Thank you.